thank you for joining us today. Could you please introduce yourself, including your name, job, area of expertise, and role in the event?
First of all, I would like to thank you for inviting me to this podcast and welcome all the listeners. My name is András Igari from Hungary, Budapest. I'm a geographer and a regional analyst. I graduated from Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest in 2020. I've been working for HETFA Research Institute since 2019, firstly as a trainee and currently as a junior analyst. At the HETFA, I've been working on a wide variety of spatial research and territorial development issues, most recently on two ESPON studies. In addition, I started my PhD studies at Eötvös Loránd University in 2020. My research topic is about spatial diffusion models. I pay particular attention to the geographical pattern of the diffusion of the COVID-19 pandemic, the causes that influence it, and the socio-economic effects of it. As I said, I'm able to participate in ESPON projects, and one of them is about the territorial impacts of COVID-19. And one of my other projects in HETFA is the so-called weekly progress reports on the spread of the coronavirus epidemic in East Central Europe. All in all, my areas of expertise cover regional inequalities, spatial diffusion processes, urban and rural planning, and methodology of spatial analysis. Shifting to the event, it was an ESPON workshop about the challenges and opportunities for shrinking areas. In continuity with the ESPON Escape project, this conference looked at some of the shrinking areas in Europe that were studied within the project, with the aim to present common trends and lines for the future development. So this workshop linked to the ESPON Escape project, which is a recently completed applied research project involving 7 institutes from Hungary. Katalin Kovács and Gergely Tagai from the KRTK Institute for Regional Research participated. The aim of this conference was to address the challenges of shrinking areas across Europe and to define areas of potential development in line with the objectives of the Territorial Agenda 2030 and the ESPON 2030 program. At the same time, the conference also aimed to present further research whose results can be used for shrinking rural regions. For this reason, we were asked to present some of the results of the ESPON Lakes project, our other ESPON project, which focused on the problems and development potential of Europe's large lake regions. So that is how I became to be a panelist at the conference.
This conference looked at the problem of economic and/or demographic rural shrinking areas and how public governments could instigate regional development and push back the tide. Could you give us some explanation of the overall problem?
Europe faces a number of demographic challenges, for example, migration, aging of population, natural decrease, etc. These challenges affect different countries and regions in different ways, and one of these special phenomena is the depopulation of rural areas, which poses serious challenges in many parts of Europe since decades. As regards the phenomenon of shrinkage, the ESPON Escape project used the definition of grassland et al. As a starting point. They said a region that is shrinking is a region that is losing a significant proportion of its population over a period greater than or equal to 1 generation. So based on this definition, the shrinking rural areas are characterized by substantial and sustained depopulation processes. But the shrinkage is a complex phenomenon. We can distinguish between the simple demographic shrinking and the complex shrinking processes. On the one hand, the simple demographic shrinking can be broken down into 2 main aspects: the so-called active shrinkage, which means outmigration, and the so-called passive shrinkage, which is connected to natural decrease and aging. On the other hand, the complex shrinking processes affect the wider economy and society of rural areas, often leading to so-called vicious cycles of decline. The expertise analyzed 4 generic types of socio-economic process, which are responsible for shrinking. The first one is the economic restructuring, which is related to the change of economic structures, preeminently the agricultural structures. The second one is the locational disadvantage, for example, isolation, sparsity, lack of natural resources. The third one is the peripherization, which is distinguished by being the consequence of macro-scale processes of spatial reorganization of economic activity, and globalization. And the fourth one are connected to disruptive events and political or systematic transitions. Naturally, these four types of processes often coexist and interact within a single locality or region, and these forming different so-called pathways to demographic shrinkage. So each of these regions have an own stories.
Could you explain the concept of a functional area to us and give us a brief example of how different areas, such as the large lake regions or rural areas in Hungary, can use it for regional development?
I would like to start my answer from a slightly further on the role of geographic characteristics in European Union cohesion policy. There is a long history of addressing different geographical specificities in European cohesion policy. Several types of regional typology have been developed in recent decades, especially rural regions and border, coastal island regions, or sparsely populated areas, etc. The limitation of these specific areas was in most cases based on one or more indicators or a special geographical characteristic and was mainly targeted at not level regions. They aim to show the diversity of Europe's regions and, where necessary, to give special support to specific types of areas. However, share of these specific types of regions in the European Union funds allocated to cohesion policy has gradually decreased since the early 1990s, and nowadays only border, outermost, and sparsely populated regions receive specific funding. At the same time, a new approach and methodology has emerged in the European policy discourse. These are the so-called functional areas. These not just typify existing regions according to their geographical, social, or economic characteristics, but focus on spatial networks and flows. In this case, the focus is on the different functional links and soft cooperations that define new types of territories. So this new approach not just typifies existing regions, but it defines new types of territorial units. Moving on the large lake regions mentioned by you, we find that both approaches can be used. On the one hand, NUTS regions can be typified in terms of whether they are related with large lakes. Large lakes mean the lakes which are larger than 100 square kilometers. So this is the first aspect. But on the other hand, these regions have explicitly complex functional relationships. These regions are functionally complex areas with complex networks of different actors and multiple partially overlapping functional areas. Furthermore, they are mostly fragmented by administrative subdivisions and demographically and economically varied areas, but the lakes and their rich ecological, social, cultural, and economic values connected these areas together. The ESPON project, together with Spatial Foresight and Friedrich Alexander University and the stakeholders from the three analyzed large lake regions, the Lake Balaton, Lake Constance, and Lake Vanern, we have identified some special policy options that can help the integrated development of these kind of regions. We did it because we believe that in complex and sensitive systems such as the large lake regions, it is very important to develop different policy areas and territories in an integrated way. It seems that the general challenge of integrated territorial development is to bridge administrative borders. Furthermore, it will be important if we can shift in the perspectives from the lake as a negligibility to center of attention, and from the lake as a barrier to catalyst of integrated development. So, according to me, it can help the development of large lake regions in an integrated way if we see them as a functional areas and support the strengthening the functional links across administrative borders. However, this is not only an important issue for the large lake regions. This could also be an important issue for all other types of functional areas, for example, for shrinking rural regions too. For example, in the case of peripheral areas separated by borders, in inner rural peripheries, remote, sparsely populated regions, or rural areas affected by spread and backwash effects of cities, it is also useful to be able to look at these areas as a functionally coherent unit, and according to me, it can be a basis of their further development.
You work for the HATEFA Research Institute, which works on areas such as local and regional development, public policy and impact assessment, and international cooperation. The Institute is also currently working with ESPON on looking at territorial impacts of COVID-19 on European regions and cities. Have you seen any differences in rural or shrinking regional development or demographic changes, such as through migration, due to the pandemic?
As you mentioned, HITF is engaged in a wide range of disciplines, public policy analysis, economic and social research, as well as the above-mentioned spatial analysis and urban and rural development. We apply the results of economics, politics, and of course regional analysis to better understand the particularities of the Hungarian and European economy and society, and the characteristics of Hungarian and European policy answer. In particular, we have started to open up to European issues in recent years. The analysis of the territory impact of COVID-19 pandemic is the second ESPON project in which we have been involved. Although the project is still ongoing, there are still some results that I would like to mention. On the one hand, we have observed a shift in the hotspots and the center of the pandemic from the centers to the peripheries of Europe. The first wave mainly affected the large cities of Western Europe, so the areas which are strongly connected to international networks. However, the later waves were more affected peripheral areas of Europe, especially the eastern countries and rural regions. Overall, in the first 2 years of the pandemic, the United Kingdom and the eastern states, especially Bulgaria, Romania, and Poland, were the worst affected in terms of mortality rates. However, not all peripheral regions have been hit heavily by the pandemic. Mortality rates are particularly low in the sparsely populated northern regions. There may be several reasons for these phenomena. On the one hand, the accessibility and geographical location of certain regions was an important issue in the initial phase of this crisis. But over time, the vulnerability of the countries and regions became more important factor. As for the social impact of the pandemic, there are also being examined by us, but it is more difficult to make such statements. On the one hand, much data isn't yet available, so we were only seeing the effects of the first year of the COVID-19 pandemic. On the other hand, the impact of the pandemic has been affected differently in different sectors of socio-economic effects. It means that on the one hand, the labor market and economic production have seen a brief period of intense decline and a recovery, both in urban and rural areas due to the closures and temporary shutdowns in some sectors. At the same time, the longer-term social impacts, including poverty, deprivation, educational dropouts, health and mental health issues, etc., are all beginning to unfold, and it is likely to be years before the final conclusions can be drawn. However, based on the effects of previous crises, for example, the economic crisis of 2008 and 2009, and the spatial pattern of mortality, it seems that shrinking rural regions are likely to face more severe challenges than average, and the above-mentioned processes possibly increase selective outmigration. For this reason, I'm afraid that the COVID-19 crisis could strengthen existing problems of the shrinking rural regions, but we can make clear and final statements about it.
Could you tell us more about the conclusions and insights taken from this conference? How can these be used to address the territorial challenges facing Hungary and Central and Eastern Europe?
So, as pointed out by the conference and by the ESPON project, there are significant differences between the main regions of Europe in terms of shrinkage. Most of the shrinking rural and intermediate regions in the Western countries are mid or mid-low income regions with servitized or industrial economic structure and moderate, mostly passive shrinking, while in the Eastern countries, the rural and intermediate regions could characterize differently. On the one hand, there are very low income regions with above average agricultural characteristics and with severe passive and active shrinking. On the other hand, there are agro-industrial low-income regions with moderate, mostly passive shrinking. It's interesting that the former East German shrinking regions form a separate group, which are mainly industrial, mid-low income regions with severe passive and active shrinking. The general reasons for the depopulation of rural areas are the aging of Europe and the population attractiveness of urban areas. But in rural shrinkage in East Central Europe seems different from the shrinking rural regions of northern and southern peripheries, which is caused by the so-called system-level disruptions. It means that these shrinking rural regions of Central Europe faced with many systemic disruptions in the first decades of the communist dictatorship. The forced industrialization and land collectivization resulted a highly selective rural out-migration. So the fall of the state society again caused systematic disruption. The subsequent transition period was characterized by polarization of rural space and many of rural areas being emptied, which helped the shape and entrench spatial and social marginalization. And finally, the European Union integration and globalization have also had a negative direct impact on these areas, causing a new wave of out-migration. So all in all, these recurring system-level disruptions and the resulting distortions have contributed to the irreversibility of rural decline, making the shrinking regions in the eastern member states more vulnerable to dependency and marginalization and pandemics and other crises than the shrinking rural regions in the other parts of Europe. In East Central Europe, the rural shrinkage is one of the main territorial challenge in this part of Europe. It is a complex problem which needs complex approaches and development. There is a need to improve the economy, infrastructure, and also the quality of life in rural areas, while at the same time there is a need to help upskilling people and helping them to thrive in the rural regions and help them stay in these rural regions.
And where can we find out more?
So far, 3 ESPON projects have been mentioned by me: the applied research of ESPON Escape, the targeted analysis of ESPON lakes, and the applied research of territorial impacts of COVID-19. I recommend you to check the results and the connected reports in the espon.eu webpage. In addition, of course, I can recommend the other ESPON research that has already been carried out or is currently underway. In the meantime, preparations for the ESPON 2030 program have also begun, and you can follow the progress on this program in the ESPON EU website too. We are looking forward to the new research period, as we have a number of ideas on how to analyze aspects of each of the 4 thematic action plans made public by ESPON so far. Finally, if you are interested in the results of analyses and projects by HETFA researchers, I also recommend our website, the hetfa.eu. Here you can read about the results of our projects and analyses.